In the third millennium, the world changed. Climate, nations, all were in upheaval. The earth transformed into a poisonous, scorched desert known as the Cursed Earth. Millions of people were crowded into a few megacities, where roaming bands of street savages created violence the justice system could not control. Law, as we know it, collapsed. And from the decay rose a new order, a society ruled by a new elite force. A force with the power to dispense both justice and punishment. They were the police, jury, and executioner, all in one. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Cast Dice with a very special episode about Judge Dredd. Now, Cast Dice is a podcast that explores the great big wild world of tabletop gaming that we are experiencing today. Now, I have said many times that we're in the middle of a gaming renaissance. There are just too many good games that we can spend our hobby time and our hobby dollars on. It can lead to a serious case of not knowing what to play next. I mean, you don't want to miss out. There's just too many good things. Now, normally when this podcast is recorded, I have a guest on Skype, and it is just usually myself and a guest or guests via the internet and my little dog, Jim. But today, I am very happy to announce that we have an in-the-studio guest. You will know this gentleman as longtime bolt-action Chinese player. He has been on Cast Dice before, and like me, he is a massive 2000 AD enthusiast, at least on the tabletop. John, welcome back to Cast Dice.
Hi, Brad. Thanks for having me back.
Dude, it's a pleasure to have you. Now, John, and we are going to get into the game itself in a little bit, but first we're going to talk about Dredd sort of as an idea and sort of how we know Dredd and where we came to it. But before we do that, you've been painting up Dredd and Strontium Dog models, the Warlord 2000 AD models for quite a while now, and they look fantastic, man. You want to talk to us a little bit about what you like about the models themselves, maybe something like that? Because I know a lot of people know the old Dredd models, and these are a very different animal, aren't they?
They are. So I picked up the Strontium Dog models soon after their release. Were they released last year? Was it 2019?
It was 2019.
Yeah.
Yep. It was. So they did Strontium Dog 1 year. I think it was 2018 even, and then Dredd came out at the end of 2019.
Yeah. So I picked them up fairly soon after release, and look, they're lovely models. They're metal. Mm-hmm. They're 32 millimeter scale, whatever. Mm-hmm. Whatever that means.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Bigger than bolt action, significantly larger.
Bigger than bolt action, but quite human proportion. They're not super heroic in their proportions, right. I would say.
They don't have big heads unless they're supposed to.
That's right. Which some of them do. But yeah.
That's why I say that.
The detail on them is, because they're not super deformed, because they're not super heroic, they quite fine in their detail in a lot of cases, which can be tricky when it comes to priming and painting. They're very easy to over prime.
Oh, okay. Good to know, as I'm about to do some priming. Yeah.
Look, especially faces and so forth, I found were quite fine detail. They have, and I know some people care about this more than others, but they have integrated bases, or pudding bases.
Oh, do they?
They do. And they have thick, heavy, very well attached integrated bases.
I'm looking at some now. Yes, they do. Those are very thick. Now, you're talking the Strontium Dog models.
I am talking the Strontium Dog models, right, because that's where I started. And
right.
So recently, of course, we've had the release of the follow-up game, Judge Dredd, which is using the virtually identical rule system.
Right.
Fully cross-compatible. And the new models are proportions and so forth are the same, but the casting material is quite different. So the new Dredd models are using something that Warlord is calling Warlord resin.
Yeah, it is. But it isn't like your standard hard resin that we're used to with as far as their tanks go and their vehicles, right? It's a different animal.
It is, and in fact, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Judge Dredd's bike, so probably all the vehicles in this game, I'm going to speculate, but the bike's the one that I've seen, is in a harder resin.
Oh, nice.
That's more familiar. But the characters are in this slightly rubbery resin material that I haven't seen before.
It's a little soft plastic almost, but it's not, if that makes sense. So, for example, you can cut it quite easily. So if you want to cut it apart and reposition models, you can do that. I mean, really easily. You can use it with just a sharp hobby blade. You don't even need to use snips. But by the same token, if you are used to clearing flash off the back of your hobby blade, it can lead to feathering, right?
Yeah, so it's got this funny habit of feathering or tearing slightly. I haven't had luck scraping the mold lines. I've had to cut them, which is you then risk damaging the detail.
It can be problematic.
So I'm still trying to figure the material out. It is different from other models that I've worked with. So I found that a little challenging. My only other criticism of them is that they're flat cast. So they're did you want to speak to what flat cast is?
Yeah, so for those of us who have been wargaming a million years, in the olden days, you often had miniatures that were one-piece medals. And when you did that, you often saw models holding guns to their chests. And if you sort of laid them on their backs, you would often be able to, I mean, they would have width, of course, but it would be relatively flat. All of the sort of the motion of the model would be, sideways, not necessarily coming out at you. With, of course, the advent of more models having arms that were removable, you got to see more motion and more, how should I say, I guess model parts extending out on the axis that is sort of perpendicular to the motion and the movement of the rest of the model, if that makes sense. So a lot of these are, at least in the core box, and I believe that once, and I know you've told me this, and I know other people have mentioned it since we've played, that some of the newer models outside of the core box do come in multi-part, so they do have a greater range of movement. But I think because the models for the core box themselves were put in there for I think they call it in the UK high street sales, so that you can put it in bookstores. You can put it in, in a shop window, and little Johnny can come in and pick it up. It's like the new Games Workshop plug-and-play miniatures that you just, in all their core sets, you basically stick them together with your hand and off you go. With this, they're already together. All you have to do is slap some paint on them and off you go, or you can just play with them unpainted if you're, unfamiliar with how to do that, if you're new to the hobby, so to speak. But it allows you to get in and playing the game quickly. So in that regard, I think it's very clever. And also, I think by putting this sort of resin plasticky material, it is, you open it up and the pieces look like board game pieces. So if you are used to board games and you're not used to tabletop wargaming, I think that these models are perfect for that. And I think that's what Warlord is shooting for. But it does lead to, now for the judges, it doesn't bother me. I know it bothers you for the senior judge, but for 2 of the 8 gang members that come in the basic Dredd core box, one of them has problematic hips. I'm not sure if he's broken his hip and he's sort of limping along, or the other guy. But I mean, it's fine. I think a little more 3D would be great. And I think we'll see that in a lot more of the additional models, like the city defense and maybe the additional judges and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I can certainly speak to the. So I've picked up the. I want to say it's the Street Judges pack.
Oh,
I
did
think
you?
That's what it's called. Which comes with, I think, 5 additional judges. 4 of whom have separate arms.
Cool.
So yeah, look, they are much more dynamic models. Haven't had a chance to paint them up yet, but they look great. And whilst we're saying this, and I think some of this might be coming off as, fairly negative. We've talked about the issues with the resin and the flat cast. The models do look great. I want to put that out there because
they look really good. I'm holding them right now, and there's some fantastic detail on these models that I'm really looking forward to painting. And even some of these 2D model, I sort of flat cast, not 2D. There's a guy who's sort of pulling a gun out of his holster, sort of holding his gun sideways with his head turned, and that's just a pose that I don't think I've seen on a flat pack model before. And looking at it, damn, that looks good. And, again, almost all the models it's really cleverly done. So unless you, some of them are very flat, but some of them, they all have the detail, though. So now you've been painting these.
Yes.
So how does the detail paint up?
So I haven't had a chance to paint the gang members yet. I've painted the judges that come in the core box. The 2 judges. Had a real blast painting them. Part of that is because the judges are so iconic and their uniforms are they're brightly colored, or there's the dark base, the brightly colored knee pads and gloves and so forth, and the gold epaulets and whatnot, or shoulder pads. They're just a real pleasure to paint up. It's quite a simple color scheme, but you can do a lot with it. Again, with the detail of the model, and I had a crack at non-metallic metal on the shoulder pads and so forth, which was a blast, and they paint up really nicely and they look fantastic on the tabletop.
Oh man, they look so good. We played a game earlier this week and took some pictures, so if you haven't seen the pictures and you want to see what we're talking about, please go to the Cast Ice Facebook page, and there was a post this week. If you just type in Judge Dredd, you will find, if you look, you will find pictures of that game, and man, so much fun. And I think what really made that was we played it on painted city terrain, and your beautiful models with that. I mean, nothing like playing it, playing the right models on the right board. And when you have those beautiful models on that table to start with, damn, it looked the part. It was so good. So I think we've sort of gone down a tangent a little bit, in that we've talked about the models, but maybe we should backtrack and talk about Judge Dredd. Now, you and I both have very different Dredd experiences, and I don't necessarily want to bog down too far into our history with Dredd as much as I want to get to Dredd's history, if that makes sense. But how do you know Dredd? When did sort of Dredd come into your life?
So I've had a bit of a scattered relationship with the series since quite young. I know a lot of, you hear British people talking about growing up with the comics and, being a really core part of their adolescence. I did not have access to many comics, and the comics that I did have access to growing up were nowhere near as violent as Dredd. Very much not okay in our household. And I think my first contact with Dredd was in a small stack of comics that my older cousins had. And I remember flicking through and just being blown away by how violent and gory and I can't even tell you which Dredd comic it was, because in my head it's all jumbled up with a Conan comic that was in there and a bunch of other stuff, all of which I just remember being super violent. But I remember the iconic Dredd helmet, of course, the uniform, the look, like that was just burned into my brain. Like you see that once and it's so striking. That,
exactly.
Carlos Esquerra's design, it's, you know why Dredd works. You see that, like, it's a bizarre concoction of elements.
It is, yeah.
You know, and we'll talk about this a bit more in when we talk about the movies and how it translates into the real world. But if you take it part by part, it looks like it shouldn't work. For some reason, it really works.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It's striking and exciting and you know, so iconic.
Absolutely, man. I can't echo that enough. Now, while you were in Australia, I was in the U.S., and we were coming from this in different angles. But I was a predominantly Marvel guy. I read a lot of comics growing up, but I read very few Marvel comics until I moved to Japan. And when I moved to Japan, I bought comics on U.S. military bases, and they were only Marvel and DC. So 2000 AD was not something that I was aware of. But when I moved back from Japan, the friend that introduced me to gaming as a whole and introduced me to basically comic books had a stack of 2000 AD comics. And it was the art that grabbed me right off the bat. Like, the old school Dredd art is so iconic. I know we're throwing that word around a lot today, but it totally got me. And as a early teenager, I could not get my head around in a good way. It was dark, it was violent, but there was a sense of humor, and I mean a really wacky one. When you named, and I've mentioned this when I did the other Dredd cast, the Enid Blyton block.
Yes.
I mean, what? Naming one of the city blocks after beloved children's author? Amazing. How can I get more of that dark sense of humor? But there was always this sort of tongue-in-cheek almost, especially in the naming of things, putting Jimmy Carter's face on Mount Rushmore, things like that. I thought it was, it caught me, and I read all of his comics, and I collected a few 2000 ADs, but that was right sort of at the end of my comic collecting sort of life. And I think gaming sort of took over as my main hobby, and at which point I was also playing in bands. And so I think that comics sort of took the back seat. But years later, I got a job at Games Workshop. And the very first time, we would get bonuses occasionally in the form of little bags of metal in my department. And the very first time I was ever given a bag and told I can go into the metal room and I can fill up my little baggie and have a certain amount of weight of lead, I can get anything I want. And I literally spent 2 to 3 hours in the metal room going through because it's the first time I'd been let in properly, going down each and every shelf, looking at every miniature that Games Workshop had and was making. And tons of that stuff was out of print and wasn't in their catalogs, but it was still in the metal room. And I was going, oh my God, this is in there. Oh my God, this is in there. But the thing that absolutely jumped at me was the Arbites models. And I found, I think it was like 6 boxes of Arbites. Each box had one miniature, but it was just filled with that miniature. And we're talking like, like a not a tackle box. It was a deep box where you would, like, if you go to Bunnings or Home Depot, where you would get like screws or nails. Like, it was this deep box filled with Arbites. And I was like, yep, I will get that. So I got almost my full Arbites army in my one bag and went, yes. And back then I was a very poor painter, and I sprayed it all black. And I painted all the shoulder pads gold, and I painted the little red bits, so it looked very much like the Stallone Dredd, because I wasn't sure I could paint the comic Dredd, but I wanted to have a Dredd army. And in Citadel Journal, there was an Arbites army list, so I painted up a bunch of chimeras to be little police tanks and that sort of thing. And so I played that army for years. And ironically, the very first person I played with that army once I'd painted it was John Stallard, owner of Warlord Games. So it all comes full circle. But yeah, I got to yell, "I am the law," and do all those terrible things. But at the same time, I hunted down a bunch of Judge Dredd comics and fell in love with Dredd again. But yeah, man, I've loved Dredd. I'm sorry to have let that army go, but it was really poorly painted. And of course, these days, those models are worth their weight in gold. I probably should have just stripped them and kept them. But anyway, moving on. If we get into Dredd, though, I mean, the comics hooked me, but then the images from the Stallone movie. Now, I know this is a really unpopular opinion. I actually don't mind the Stallone movie. Clearly, I painted an entire army about it. Now, of course, everyone says that Carl Urban's 2012 Dredd is a better movie. So I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about Dredd as a movie character, because that's how a lot of people from, the gaming standpoint tend to know it, especially in the United States.
Yeah. So, yeah, and look, absolutely. So my first contact with Dredd was certainly that little cache of comics. But my next, or, where I was then reminded of that character after that was the release of the 95 Stallone Judge Dredd movie, which I saw in cinemas. And look, it was for a long time the main thing I associated with Dredd until I went back to the comics, reinvestigated, started reading again. So, and I think for a lot of people, that's probably the case. There's probably a lot of people out there who have seen the 95 movie, have seen the 2012 movie, are aware that Dredd is a comic book character, but maybe haven't read very much. And yeah, I look, it is, despite the fact there's 40 years of comic books, you could say we can just ignore the movies. I think for a lot of people, that is the Dredd they know.
Exactly. So I don't think I don't think we can ignore it. Now, I'm going to sort of throw out a few things. Some of the things, so let's talk movies, shall we, gang? And you can play along at home. Now, I'm going to go first, and I'm going to throw it to you. And now this is completely unscripted, and I'm throwing you in the deep end here. But I want you to give me 3 to 5 things, and they may be some of the things that I mentioned, that you absolutely... or that you like about Stallone Dredd, and then maybe a couple of things that you don't like. The object here is to try and be more positive, which I know can be difficult when talking about that movie. I get it. A lot of people tell me it's one of the worst movies ever. I disagree. But let's talk about some of the things that movie gets right, and then maybe we can compare it with the Urban Dredd, and then... So I'm going to start mentioning back and forth, and we'll ping pong. So I'm going to start talking about the things I like. First things first. Besides the fact that it's got an amazing intro. I read it at the beginning of the show. It's read by James Earl Jones. And while that's playing, you get the Dredd theme. Now, we went to play Judge Dredd the other day, and I was thinking, we're playing, I'll put on the Dredd music. And I put on the music from the 2012 movie, and it was just like guitar riffs, drum beats, and noise. It is very timely. It's very of its time, but it doesn't feel like if you're going to play a game on a tabletop, I'm not sure that's the soundtrack you want to put on, especially, having just rewatched Indiana Jones and a bunch of the Star Wars movies, those iconic themes that run through those movies. Judge Dredd, the Stallone Dredd. My God, I love that theme. And I know people crap on that movie, but I get that theme song stuck in my head all the time to this day. And I love it. Do you?
Look, 95 Judge Dredd soundtrack has a song by The Cure. Now,
not exactly the best match ever, but yeah.
No, but, this is... what can you say about that, right? Like, it has uniforms designed by Versace.
Yeah, exactly.
There's stuff about the 95 Dredd where you're like, wow, this is amazing.
Yeah.
And if I was reading about this, this is what's coming, this is who's involved, Stallone aside, but and maybe Rob Schneider. Anyway, we'll get to that.
Definitely Rob Schneider.
But there's things about that film that you're like, wow, really? Like this is a huge get, and this is a amazing stuff, right?
The cast is outstanding.
Yeah. And the one thing. So I'm gonna jump into one thing I like.
Yeah, please.
About Dredd 95, and like the initial world building. Like there is, look. it is a bit knockoff Blade Runner.
Yes.
Okay. Like it is.
Yeah, but Dredd itself is a bit knockoff Blade Runner. Sorry, which
Vice
came
versa,
first?
perhaps?
The other way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, that's what I mean. Yeah.
But yeah, look, when that film starts and there's the hover cars and the neon and all the punks wandering around and everything, it immediately creates this world. And yeah, there's some sketchy special effects right out the gate, which you look at today and go, "Ooh, gee, I wish you hadn't
done that.
Wish you'd gone practical on that one."
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
But it is far more, I think, evocative of Mega City 1 of the comics than 2012 Dredd, which kind of just feels like today only in a bad city.
Yeah. So I just going off what you're saying, this is actually my next point. Mega City 1 in the comics feels claustrophobic. It feels, there's lots of neon, at least from the art, from the comics, from what I've seen. It feels dirty. It feels claustrophobic. There's all that neon. And I think the Judge Dredd the 1995 movie captures Mega City 1 way better.
Yeah.
Now, as you say, flying cars, it matches the comic book completely. The Dredd from Carl Urban's Dredd, the 2012 one, has drones, which is very modern today. But if you look at the cars, the bad guys are driving a VW van from the 80s. If this is the far future, I understand if it's, the world's gone down the gurgler, you're probably not going to have a lot of new cars. But you would think that there would be newer cars. Everything that you see out there isn't just what you could find on the road now. It's sort of what you would find on the road 20 years ago. It felt very dated. And the lawgiver that Dredd's riding in Stallone Dredd looks a lot more like the comic than the Carl Urban Dredd. Now, yeah. I think that the vehicles, the world, Mega City 1, it feels like robots going around selling recycled food. It feels to me much more like, Mega City 1 from the comic book. And I like that a lot. Now, is it perfect? Absolutely not. However, I think it's a closer representation.
I agree. I think there might be something to be said for having Dredd set in a more contemporary world, or in a world that resembles our world a little bit more, because that might speak to maybe how close we are to Dredd's world right now, which is a bit of an uncomfortable feeling. But, there might be, I don't know if it's intentional or not, but there might be a comment in there about like, hey, this is not very far off anymore. This is not flying cars. This is not Blade Runner, which did Blade Runner just happen on our the year of Blade Runner? Yes. So, but like the future, the bits that Dredd gets right might not have been the flying cars.
Right.
It might have just been the authoritarianism.
Yay. Yeah, exactly. Well, let's, so I think my next comment is, the Stallone Dredd has a lot of nods, to the comics. The director was a massive Judge Dredd fan and fought hard for the project, and it went through, and he was very excited, and he had all these ideas that he worked with the writers to incorporate as many. It was almost as like he was trying to cram in as many Judge Dredd storylines into one movie as possible. Now, Judge Dredd sort of operates on two levels on the comic, from my reading, and usually it's either this global event like Mega City 1 versus Sovmeg having, a war that will end all wars, or, the dark judges taking over an entire city block and killing everything, and then they have to go back to the dark judges universe. Those are sort of big overarching, mega events. Judge Caligula taking over the city and needing to be overthrown, that kind of thing. But Dredd also operates on there's a person who's broken the law, and then Dredd has to find them, and in finding them, he solves the crime, like a Batman or a Sherlock Holmes kind of situation with a bigger gun. And I think The Carl Urban Dredd is far more the small scale. It is very much the, I'm going to solve this situation. I'm going to figure out what the mystery is. Why are they after us? Oh, it's because it's the distribution for Slowmo. Let's solve that problem. At the end, everyone's punished appropriately. Movie's over. Meanwhile, Stallone Dredd almost ends Mega City 1. And both feel appropriate, though. Now, I think the big problem with doing that is, on one hand, trying to cram too much in overcrowds it and makes things meaningless. Like the reporter side story about he's mentioned a couple times, and then Rico dressed as Dredd shoots him. Spoilers. And I mean, it's an interesting plot point, but I mean, pretty sure that was a comic storyline, and they really wanted, that should have been teased out. However, it was sort of introduced, dead. Okay, next. And you kind of wish there was more to it. And so part of that was the director trying to cram too much in. And then part of that was also the 1990s, where they would take the name of something and sort of the look of something, X-Men, and put it in a movie, but make it completely different. Because heaven forbid the audience who likes this thing might get what they like about that thing, G.I. Joe movie. It's just frustrating that was so prevalent for so long. Fantastic Four movie. But if we get into, I don't know, Stallone got involved, and Stallone was part of that problem because Stallone wanted to Stallone-ize Dredd, and you got the idea that maybe he read 4 or 5 pages of Dredd and then knew what he wanted and did it in a Stallone way. Now, I am a Stallone fan. I like his movies. I like this movie. However, the fact that, and I guess I'm getting into some of the negatives here. I mean, the fact that he takes his helmet off like 5 minutes in is massively problematic. Yep. The fact that he's showing all the emotions in the world, really? It isn't Dredd. And if you could say, well, I've heard people say, it would be better to have put Carl Urban's Dredd in the other Dredd movie, but I don't think that would work either. If you kept Stallone in the helmet and you put a real costume on him, like that isn't like some weird Stallone, like stylized jumpsuit with giant shoulder pads.
So
I don't know.
So I'm going to jump in, and
Please.
I'm going to bring some positivity to your negativity here.
I don't know.
Around the 95 Dredd. So I actually think the uniform in the 95 Dredd fits the world okay.
Yeah.
Like it's
closer to the comic.
Yeah. And there has historically always been challenges in bringing comic uniforms or superhero uniforms into movies because often you're like, well, this looks absolutely ludicrous.
Yes.
And sometimes that results in just everything being black all of the time.
All of the time.
Yeah.
Yes.
And look, I think you're right in saying that bringing Carl Urban's Dredd into the 95 Dredd wouldn't solve the problems, and it wouldn't solve the problems of either movie.
Right.
I don't think. You've correctly identified, I think, that whilst the world of Stallone's Dredd is far closer to the world of the comics, it does just kitchen sink it. It's like, maybe there's only ever going to be one Dredd movie, so we need to put every character in.
Wait, hold on. Let's look. Just checklist a couple of things. ABC Warriors, the robots, Cursed Earth, named judges, all of them. Magruder, Hershey. I mean, the only person they don't put in is Anderson. Rico, the Angel Gang.
Yep.
I mean, you get Mean in there, obviously, but I mean, there's just so many things. And just a fun fact for those who are Judge Dredd comics and a fan of it, I quite enjoyed the day that the law died. The storyline where Judge Dredd is assassinated or attempted assassination by, I believe it's Judge Cal, and it's the how do we get rid of Judge Cal? And of course he nominates his successor to be the Goldfish, and he makes the other judge wear a dress, and there's all sorts of things like that. But the guy who ends that, the character that ends that whole storyline, isn't Dredd. It's a massive, he's like a 7-foot muscle-bound, baseball bat carrying mutant that lives in the sewers under Mega City 1 named Fergie. It wasn't until recently that I realized that, do you know who's Fergie in the Stallone Dredd? Rob Schneider. That's the character. Like, it's the same guy. And you're like, that doesn't make a lick of sense. And so that was a really poor, and it was, he needed the comedy, he needed the comedic sidekick, I guess. But did he, though? It's Dredd. I mean.
Okay, so, and this is probably going to destroy any credibility I ever have with anybody that likes Dredd.
Yes.
But,
go ahead. You say you're Rob Schneider, you're out.
No, I'm going to say, no. Dredd having a comedy sidekick character is very in keeping with the comics.
True.
Anybody who's read anything with Walter the Wobot, knows
Love
that.
it.
And
True.
It's not just Dredd. This is a very John Wagner thing to do. Like if you look at Strontium Dog and the Gronk,
yes,
the Gronk
exactly.
is a very similar character.
True.
Super goofy, super silly, but also used, throughout the course of the comic and given quite some weight, and some pretty serious events occur around these characters as well.
Agreed.
And, those wacky characters are very much a part of Dredd and the Dredd universe.
True.
Is Rob Schneider a good part of the 95 Dredd movie? Look, he's
got some great parts. I won't lie. He's got some great lines.
So he does something. There's something at the start of, the first interaction between Dredd 95. One of the first interactions in Dredd 95 is between Dredd and Rob Schneider's character Fergie.
Yeah,
and it does something well that I feel like the 2012 film fails. And that is Fergie is given an extreme punishment. He's sent to the ISO cubes, I think, for
5 years.
5 years for hacking a servo droid or something to that.
Yes.
To hide himself during a block war. So he's placed there, and this is pure Dredd social commentary. Like, this is very Dredd stuff where this guy comes back from prison, comes back from the ISO cubes, is immediately dumped into one of the worst blocks.
Citizen
in Mega
Riot.
City 1. Yeah. He's
turns into block war.
placed in a block war, and he does what he can do to protect himself, and in doing so breaks a law and is then given the full punishment for having broken that law and immediately sent back. So he's given no chance. The system just destroys him.
Yeah.
And that Dredd is the agent that enforces that, who goes in and does that. And that's so central to the Dredd character of, he is often blindly enforcing an extremely unjust system, and the Dredd 95 movie goes out of its way right out the gate to show you that.
And I think he follows it up with the line where he's like, I'm being misjudged, I was in the middle of war. I mean, what else could I do? And he's like, thrown out the window? And Jed said, well, at least that wouldn't have been against the law.
Yeah, that's right.
And that is very Dredd comic, that line. And I just think, okay, that's good.
Yeah. And so to counterpoint that, Dredd 2012 has... So its version of this, I feel like, is the beggar at the front of the the city block. So Dredd arrives on the scene of the crime with Anderson in tow, and they immediately see somebody begging at the door. And as part of Anderson's testing, Dredd asks her what the penalty for that is, and she says whatever it is, 5 years in the ISO cubes, or
3 years.
3 years in the ISO cubes. Thank you. And she then says, "But prioritize the murders," and Dredd says, "Correct," and then says to the man who's begging, "Get out of here! I don't want to see you when we get back."
Right.
And look, whilst the Dredd of the comics does let people off with cautions, this is something that he does. If you're trying to establish this character as being this, blind enforcer of an unjust legal system, having one of the first things he does is let somebody who's breaking the law off the hook.
Yeah.
I feel like you're immediately failing that character.
Yeah.
And you're also making him seem like he's got a sense of justice outside the law, which I feel like the law being his sense of justice is very central to the Dredd character.
Yeah. I think Anderson works well. Just to go back to what you're saying about how Fergie is a good comedic and that good comedic sidekick, while Dredd doesn't always have a comedic sidekick in the comic books. If you were going to pull the no humor Carl Urban, look at my chin Dredd, and don't get me wrong, I love that character, and I want to see the TV series of that character, and I hope it's still being made. You need to inject some sort of social, otherwise, social, emotional something into the movie from somewhere, and that's where Anderson comes in.
Yeah.
She's compassionate. She feels bad about shooting people. She feels she lets people go with extenuating circumstances. And so I think she was necessary in order to prevent the movie from being all out bloodshed and turning into one of the Punisher movies when they didn't have the social commentary in it. If that makes sense. So I think Anderson was a good counterpoint to Dredd, although definitely not comedic.
And look, I would argue that, and here is a very uncontroversial statement, the 2012 Dredd is simply a better movie than the 95 Dredd.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, insofar as it is an action movie, or any sort of movie, really, the way that it's paced, the flow of it, the way the characters interact, how it starts and ends, and everything in between. Like, it's concise, it's clever, it doesn't lag at any point. It's really enjoyable. It's just better as a movie, hands down.
Now I have a little question to ask you, a little trivia here, and you can play at home, gang. The Stallone Dredd movie versus the Urban Dredd movie. Which one is longer? Think about it for a second. And if you know the answer, do you know the answer?
So I think that I do, but only because I very recently, in the last 2 days, have watched the Stallone Dredd movie and noted that it was 89 minutes or...
It's an hour and like 36 something minutes. Yeah.
It's quite short.
Doesn't feel short though, does it?
Does not feel short.
No, but... Do you know which one? So you think that one's shorter?
I suspect that one's shorter, yeah.
They're the same time.
Are they?
They're almost identical. Yeah. Carl Urban feels much shorter.
And look, that's unsurprising, again, just because of how scattershot the Stallone Dredd is, how much it tries to cram in, how many breaks in the story they take to do something different, and you're like, well, why are we off here doing this now? It feels much longer than it is. It feels way more than an hour and a half.
It does.
And the 2012 Dredd just goes by at a clip, no, I
hear you. And I was so glad that they did honor the I am the law and they put it into the urban movie. Now, of course, that's from the comic books. You can hear it in the Anthrax song, I Am the Law. All that. By the way, that's how that song has not been either of the movies. I do not know. Anyway.
But he never says, I knew you'd say that. I just don't.
But exactly. Thank you. And there was a moment at the very end where he's about to throw Lena, what's her name? I can't remember. Mama. Through the window. And you look at his face and it stops. And I was thinking, having just watched the Stallone movie, and she says something, and he said, and you can literally see him saying, I knew you would say that. And I was like, oh, please don't do it. Don't do it. I missed it if he did it the first couple times I saw this movie. And he doesn't. He says something else. But that line should have been there. At least it felt like it. I was like, oh, thank God they didn't do that. Because that was, while I Am the Law is from the comic, I knew you'd say that. No, that was, from my understanding, that's entirely Stallone.
Yeah, look, I'm not aware of it ever appearing in the comic, or at least not as a catchphrase. And it is such a strange thing, and I've got to think this is Stallone. I might be way off base on that, but it's such a strange thing to introduce a catchphrase for a character who already has a catchphrase.
Right? And is using it in the movie.
Yeah. No, I feel like this character needs more catchphrases, and they need to be more representative of me. It's so strange.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to see a Carl Urban movie based around, actual Blockmania, Block War. I would love to see something like that. Or, get into some of the weird, do something weird like Umpty. I mean, I guess Umpty wouldn't work in the urban universe. Because it doesn't have that sense of humor, and everyone's doing hard narcotics anyway. But maybe if we ever got the Stallone sequel, that could have been Stopping the Umpty Trade, which was the sugary sweet that was so delicious that it drove people to commit crimes. But you don't get Boing or
no
Dark Judges. Ooh, I almost feel like the Dark Judges could appear in the urban universe, but it would be way too scary. Yeah. And
look, I mean, the urban universe as it stands just from the 2012 Dredd, I mean, so there are psi powers, there's psi judges.
Yeah.
But that's about as far as it goes into the magical, into the really just off the wall stuff that the Judge Dredd universe has in it. And there's probably a way to do Dark Judges, but
I don't know if I want to see the blood, the graphic gore on. And that was one thing that the urban movie, I think, I got it. It's a dangerous universe. Can we stop doing slow-mo shots of skin rippling from explosions and being punctured by bullets? I got it. Okay, phew. All right, move on. I did like the idea of slow-mo. Anyway, we're almost 50 minutes in and we haven't talked about the game. But I did know we did want to spend a lot of time talking about the movies, and I think we have. So before we move on, though, is there anything else you wanted to touch on?
Look, I think just touching on your last point, you're talking about the excessive gore in the 2012 movie, and it really delights in the violence. And,
yes,
that the scene with the hot shot. Where the guy burns from the inside out of his face.
Unnecessary.
Both unnecessary, and I don't feel very keeping with the character because again, if Dredd's going to shoot somebody, he just shoots them. Yeah. He uses the tools necessary to get the job done. Yeah. He doesn't torture people unnecessarily, although he may do things that constitute torture. Yeah. But it's very specific to the scenario, and in that case, it just felt gratuitous. Yeah. And that brings me to something I feel like, and I flagged with you beforehand, Brad.
And we're about to get political, boys and girls.
Yeah. So look, if you're the sort of person who says, I hate politics in my discussion of pop culture, then maybe
this isn't for you
a little bit. But look, when talking about Dredd, I feel like, and especially in the current climate, it's really important to be clear about how you understand Dredd, the character. And I actually, in doing some reading in preparation for this podcast, I came across a tweet where someone had said, a person's attitude towards Judge Dredd is a great Rorschach test for their views on fascism.
Yes.
Yeah. And we are talking about our love of Judge Dredd.
Yeah.
And, you know, we both love Judge Dredd. We both love the
2000 AD universe.
Yeah, all that stuff. However, in saying that, Judge Dredd is a fascist character. He's an enforcer for an oppressive, authoritarian state. He's deliberately written as such. He's designed as such.
Yeah.
The character designer grew up under fascism in Spain. There should be no confusion that is what he is designed to be, and it is designed to be a cautionary tale about the risk of authoritarianism, what happens with the militarization of police, slavish adherence to law over ethics and justice and so forth. So when I say, and I think I can speak for you as well, Brad,
yes.
When I say I love Dredd in the context of it being satire and a cautionary tale, and I love that it shows the ridiculousness of that authoritarianism, of fascism, and I personally am deeply opposed to fascism, to authoritarianism, to oppression, and saying I love Dredd is in no way should in no way be understood to condone any of those things.
Now, that does raise an interesting point, because I do know there are a lot of people who look at Dredd as a straight action character and, celebrate that. And that is, the authors themselves are very super old school, arty, lefty types.
Yes.
And they themselves, you listened to the Comic-Con panel recently with a ton of Dredd authors who literally discussed, and the very first question was like super cop or satire, and every single one of them said without hesitation, satire. Which, if we look up the dictionary definition, the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize people's stupidity or vices, particularly in the context of contemporary politics and other topical issues. So,
Yeah, and I would like to think that most people who read Dredd, consume, the films, whatever, are aware that Dredd is a satire. I know that's something we can't absolutely assume, and I do feel like the 2012 film does not go out of its way to let you know that it is a satire. Assuming that it is, and I
don't think either of the movies is a satire. And I think that's why the 2012 Dredd sometimes feels really uncomfortable, because he's beating a perp and trying to get him to confess to a crime that if he got him back to the station house, they'd interrogate him and break him. And even Mama's like, no matter how loyal you are, once you go they break you.
Yeah.
That isn't very,
Yeah, and look, Dredd certainly is played as a fairly heroic character, I think, in the 2012 film. In fact, he's, again, the Stallone Dredd, whilst there's also, there's so many problems with its depiction of the government of that world and so forth, and it actually softens the authoritarian aspects of it, where you've got like the head judge actually not being so bad and like, we're doing this for the people and so forth. The
let this badge mean what it meant when I put it on.
Yeah.
Freedom.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, like, hang on. in the world of in Mega City 1, there's a reason that the Statue of Liberty is overshadowed by a giant statue of a judge. Like this is not subtle commentary.
No.
There is that judge means the oppression of liberty. It has always done so, and it is very clear.
Yeah. Is it liberty or freedom? He says. I can't remember.
One or the other.
One or the other.
But and 2012 Dredd. And this is something I think happens can happen in films a lot, where you create bad guys that are so bad that any action on the part of the protagonist seems justified. And, you know, they set up Mama and the Mama gang. Like, your first interaction with them is that they skin people alive, give them a drug that makes them experience things in slow motion, and throw them off a building. And, you know, it's just the most horrific death that you could conceive.
Yeah.
You know, it's awful and it's long and it's torturous and it's terrible. And you're like, well, you know, there's no fate too bad for these people.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. And by positioning Dredd against that, suddenly the actions that he's taking seem more reasonable. Whereas, you know, there's a little short in early Dredd comics, wonderful one, where it's just Dredd sees a guy dropping a candy wrapper on an escalator, and he points to him and he says, "Hey, you stop!" And the guy runs, and he knocks over someone in a hospital bed, and he grabs a little girl and uses her as a hostage briefly, and breaks a whole series of laws as he's doing this. And once Dredd catches him, Dredd says, "Well, you haven't done anything. You don't have a criminal record.
Right.
You haven't done anything wrong, other than the littering. Like, why did you do this?" And he says, "Because I was scared."
Yeah.
And you know, that doesn't come through in the 2012 movie.
No.
The excessive oppressive nature of the law in Mega City 1 creates crime.
Yeah.
And it's a self-perpetuating system. It makes things worse, and you do not get the sense you get in the 2012 film is things are so bad that the only way to respond is through excessive violence.
Right.
And I feel like that's a real shame. And it is my hope that if the Mega City 1 TV show ever does eventuate, that they have an opportunity to explore this, because Wagner, when talking about his history with the comics, does say anytime he felt like he was making Dredd too good, he would then immediately follow it up with a strip where Dredd was shown to be totally unreasonable and the bad guy. Like, you know, he counterpointed constantly.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Man, I think you said I'm just nodding everything you just said there. I'm with you. I'm not. I have nothing to value add there, other than I could not agree more.
Yeah. Well, in which case, rant over.
Yes. Well, no, that's perfect. And I think we will get to the game in one quick second. But before we do, I just want to quickly say, when I was watching the Urban Dredd just a few minutes ago, I couldn't help but notice that I didn't realize that Mama's lieutenants have her scars. Oh. I didn't realize that. At least they appear to be. The guy outside the medical center and the guy with all the tattoos who uses the minigun with Mama. All of those guys have her crisscross scars on her cheek. And I never noticed that before. And I went, that's cool. And I did like the graffiti in the 2012 one, because clearly, like, one of the guys, the van at the beginning says Drock on it. And you have, you know, as someone who works in a school, you occasionally see, you see graffiti and then people add to it. And so there was an expletive, and then right before it, or right next to it, somebody in a different color with an arrow said, "Eat blah, blah, blah." And you're like, oh, yeah, that is fairly realistic. And so, man, I think they did a really good job of being realistic in that movie in really clever ways. But, I guess it depends on what you want in your Dredd movie. Do you want more cartoony, comic booky, almost aesthetic, or do you want brutal Dredd with his helmet on? Yeah. And I think that we can find a happy medium somewhere in the middle. But as that we are almost an hour in, I think it is time to take 30 seconds and say thank you very much for listening. And I think it is time that we get to the game itself. Now, of course, I am talking about the 2000 AD licensed Warlord Games Judge Dredd miniatures game. Now, that is different, obviously, from the Mongoose Judge Dredd game, which was also distributed through Warlord and which caused quite a bit of confusion when the game first came out, which I own both. And I think the new game that just came out, authored by Andy Chambers and Robert Garish. Now, Robert Garish, of course, worked on a lot of the Doctor Who games and did a lot of other things, some of the Bolt Action source books. And Andy, of course, longtime game developer, recently has done Blood Red Skies for Warlord. And yeah, super excited about this. And now, of course, Gab Thorpe helped with the original rule set. But let's get into Judge Dredd 2000 AD Warlord Games. So, this is a really interesting rule set. It is a skirmish game. I mean, you have a handful of models per side, depending on what you are fielding. And the game itself, if you get it, or should I say when you get it, you get the option to play judges, which you would expect, and gangs, which you expect. But they also have stats for you to take a great number of other models. You can take specific judges, name judges. Of course, if you want to take Anderson and then Gerhardt, and you also have different types of judges. They have one of the dark judges, which I think is interesting. You can play Judge Death, but they don't give you the other three. And I know we're going to get to the cost of things in a minute. But of course, of the Angel Gang, again, you only get one. Mean is in here, but none of the others. You get, I mean, there's just a ton of characters. You get City Death and how you can do that. You get Fatties. They have the Sky Raiders and, you know, robots. I feel like there's a lot in here to keep you going. But that said, I also feel like there are some notable absences given the characters that are there, if that makes sense. But I think, so let's talk about the points of this game. Now, you get, and I know it's not the terminology, how many, it's credits, is it?
Notoriety.
Notoriety. So you get 40 notoriety, is that right?
So,
in a standard size game?
So there is no, you know, this is the number of points.
Okay.
So Strontium Dog, the predecessor to this, so which first introduced this rule set, had 40 notoriety as its default value.
Yeah, I knew I read that somewhere. Yeah.
And it's the models that came in that box, in the Strontium Dog box,
which was Max Bubba and his gang
and
Johnny
Wolf
and the Gronk.
Yeah. In both cases, add up to exactly 40
points.
Yeah. So, clear implication there is 40 is what they're pitching as the standard game. Now, that's no longer the case with Dredd, or it's a little bit more ambiguous. There is a note towards the back of the book when it's talking about scenarios, I think, where it gives 3 brackets of notoriety and says for a short game, you want about this many, for a medium game, you want about this many, and for a long game, you want about this many points. And I believe 40 is the top end of the medium category there. So
that makes sense given the scope of the game that we played.
That's right, yeah. So when we played around 40 notoriety, which for me feels like a bit of a sweet spot. It's worth noting. So Brad mentioned this is a skirmish game, and skirmish games, you know, when you think skirmish game, you think small number of miniatures, you know, and a fairly small play area. I'm not sure I have, and I'm sure you've seen rule sets that contain this before, but I don't know that I've seen one where an entire skirmish force can be made up of one model, which in this case...
Yeah. It's rare.
Yeah.
I mean, like Sly Marbo in the old 40K universe could be used as like a one-man army. But if we talk about this, I mean, as I think what you're getting to is Dredd's 35 by himself.
That's right.
And if you give him a Lawmaster, he's 40.
He's
41.
47, I think.
47?
The Lawmaster is 12 notoriety, if I
is it? I
recall
misread
correctly.
that.
Yeah.
But if you give him a Law Rod Mark V, and I'm not sure what that is.
That's a gun.
It's a gun. He's 40... Full stop. That's it. That's 40, period. Judge Anderson's 25 before any upgrades. You know, It goes through. I don't think it says it on that particular page, but I mean, it's interesting. And of course, Judge Death is 22, so he's more than half of a crew. Now, there have been situations where you could have Judge Death with, I don't know, minion lackeys who are scared of him, or that he's mind controlled, or that sort of thing. In fact, he has a mind control rule. Oh, actually, no, he doesn't. I'm thinking of side judges. But yeah, there are plenty of characters in here that you can take. And so, but I mean, at the smaller end, you could just have Judge Death and then people trying to get him. But I do like that you can have Mean lead, with a group of gangs.
Yeah.
With just gangers. There's so much. And I guess the characteristics that the game has makes the characters kind of feel like the comic book. But when you combine, and I know we'll get to this in a second, when you combine the War Gear cards that you get, like that, and then the Meg City cards, all of a sudden the game comes to life, and it really does feel like the comic book, because all of a sudden people have, judges have ricochet ammo, and people are throwing Boeing grenades, and there's all sorts of stealth suits, and there's all kinds of tech respirator masks that are in the comics, are in the movies, and then all of a sudden, bang, you have it, incendiary rounds that you can put on the tabletop, and it just feels cinematic. Would you agree?
Yeah. So, going back to the characters and the way the characters are handled, and the for want of a better word, the teams or warbands or whatever you want to call them are handled. One thing I really like is it is designed to be played asymmetrically. That's core to its design, and that was core to the design of Strontium Dog as well, where you can see that they started with the idea that you're going to have some heroic characters who are just superior in every way to others, and again, even just based on the content of the base box of both games, it's one very small group of very powerful characters against a much larger group of less powerful characters.
Exactly.
And again, you can see that as being core to the game's design, and I think that's absolutely key in making something like Dredd work, because if Dredd was, if the game played 5 judges versus 5 gangers, it just wouldn't feel like Dredd.
It wouldn't. It wouldn't at all.
You need to have that feeling of being outnumbered, but still have the sufficient capacity or tool set to be able to take on the greater numbers.
Yeah. And you can't just do it in a way that is like what old 40K would do, where you have, Terminator armor. All of a sudden, they're really hard to hit, they're easy to hit, but they're not easy to kill, and just pile the hits on them till they're dead. I mean, that does work, but that tends to be kind of boring and grindy out. And the way that this game does it, using the star chits, I think works really well. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how the star chits work? Because it is very similar to bolt action, but it has some very big differences that really gives it its own flavor.
Yeah, so anyone who's familiar with bolt action or any number of Warlord games, I think, where there is random activation, will be familiar with the whole chits in a bag system, or the something in a
Order
bag
dice
system.
in a bag.
Yeah, that's right. So each player has a number of chips that are a number of chips more or less equal to the number of models they have. There's some exceptions to that, but generally speaking, it's 1 chip per model. You randomly pull out a chip from the bag, and that tells you which player is activating, and that player can then choose one of their models to activate with that chip.
Correct. So in that way, it's exactly like bolt action.
That's right.
But then there are different types of chips that have a star on them, and that is where it gets different. So star chits...
Yeah, so your star chips, you have an... So first of all, you get 1 star chip per character with a cool of 4 or greater, which I'm now getting into nitty-gritty of rules, but...
By the way, I love that they put cool in there. It is so old school Games Workshop that I'm so happy it's back in a rule system to have a stat for your model. Cool.
Yeah.
But anyway, go ahead.
So the big name characters, you know, your Dredd, your Johnny Alpha, or your major antagonists, you know, your Judge Death, all those sorts of characters.
Max Bubba,
that's
it's
right.
sort of a low level one.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Max Bubba was, you know, spoilers, but he was the one that killed Wolf. You know, like he's a big bad guy in the Strontium Dog universe. Right. Although, quick aside, Strontium Dog doesn't have a lot of through characters in the bad guys because Johnny Alpha kills them almost all. So not
pretty
many,
quickly,
not many characters survive from one strip to another. So your big characters get a star chip. Star chips allow you to attempt to take an activation and then put your chip back in the bag for another activation.
Yeah. But you have to test. It's not automatic. And your test, so for example, a senior judge has a higher cool level than Max Bubba. And so they are more likely to get, for example, their star chip back in the bag. So it's a way to sort of balance it out because your more expensive characters tend to have a better chance to get the star chip back in the bag. But even the people who do have lots of chances to put them back in the bag, it's not guaranteed.
Yeah, so one of my favorite things about the star chip system is that you can use that star chip functionality on any model in the game.
Right?
So
that's cool.
you get a star chip per per main character, per character that's got a cool of 4 or greater. But when you pull it from the bag, you can use it to activate any character you've got on the table. So you can use your lowly, you know, like there's I believe Silent Weird has a notoriety value of 1. Like he's rubbish, you know, which is fairly fitting because he has absolutely no features, no perception. You know, like he's he's just a blank ball for his head. But you can use your star chip on him, and you can still try and put it back in the bag. However, when you do so, you use his cool value. Now he has a cool of 1.
Yeah.
So you can use it on him, but you've got a 5 in 6 chance of failing to put the chip back in the bag, which means, you know, you've got to really consider, is this the best use of this chip? Could I use it on another character who's got a higher cool and then have a better chance of putting it back in the bag?
Now, as just to reiterate what you just said, you have a 1 in 6 chance of putting it back in the bag per point of cool. So if you have like a senior judge who's got a cool of 4, you get to roll 4 dice, and if any of those rolled a 6, for example, they would the dice would go back in. The chip would go back in the bag.
Right.
I'm too long spending bolt action. And of course, I say a 1 in 6, and if you rolled a 6, but it's bespoke dice. They're symboled dice, so it isn't actually a 6. It's a
special. That's what they call a special. It's the 2000 AD symbol. Yeah,
exactly.
But you know, in our recent game, I came very close to taking down Judge Giant.
Oh yeah,
with probably my gruntest of grunt characters, Lowdown OF. I think he might have been my cheapest character, or certainly among them, by gambling on a star chip and succeeding, despite his low cool value, and managing to shoot you in the back, put the chip back in the bag, pull it out again, shoot you in the back again.
So, by the way, was not counting on that. I was playing the odds and saying that's really unlikely, and it happened. And you know, but it is a gamble, and it's absolutely not guaranteed. And I really like that you've got that risk reward of, I could use it on the safer character, but this guy has a better chance to make good use of it right now, and I'm going to gamble on that, and I might end up getting myself into real trouble doing so, but I also might take the game. Absolutely. Now, this does beg and this is one of the things that when I first heard about the system way back when I was talking to Gav and Andy on the Warlord cast about Strontium Dog, and it wasn't until I played you that you reminded me that I was worried that if you had a character with this, that they could keep retesting after their opponent was finished with all their activations, and that you would just basically have this heroic character who is walking around popping caps into everyone, smashing face, while your opponent was just sitting there, you know, saying, not in the face, not in the face, please don't hit me in the face. But as you pointed out, and as the authors pointed out way back when, you actually lose 2 of your cool points once everyone else's activations are done. Once it's the last one, that's it. It's much harder to pull that off. And if you gamble, it's not just that your model, you don't get your chit back in the bag. If you do that and you fail, your model takes a pin. And if you're pinned in this game, there are negative consequences to that. And the next time you activate, if you don't pass the same test on your model, you only get 1 of your 2 activations. And that's huge in a game where every model gets 2 activations per turn, where you can move or shoot or do a thing. To have what your model can do in a skirmish game like this, in some cases where you have, like where I was playing the judges, where I had 2 models, that really, I mean, that feels bad. That is not a good. And so you might gamble to get that extra activation in the turn if it's something you want. But if you don't need to, man, you shouldn't do that unless there's a lot of gambling in it, and you have to think about risk versus reward. And that, to me, feels like a well-written game where you have to think. It isn't just automatic point and click.
Yeah, and look, there's similarly when I read the rules, you know, you get this immediate fear that you're just going to have one player just get lucky over and over again and run roughshod over the other and get all the activations, and the other person gets none.
True.
And look, this is, you know, for anyone who's played bolt action enough times, you have that round where for some reason you know you've got 12 dice in that bag, but they're the last 12 dice in the bag, and your opponent pulls every one of their dice first, and you just can't believe it. It's this incredible, like, how is this happening to me?
Yes.
This is the worst. This game is terrible. Everything's broken. I hate it. But the reality is, that's a very rare occurrence. And more often than not, what happens is it's a bit swingy. Sometimes someone gets a run of activations. Sometimes the other person gets a run of activations. And it works to mediate your expectations. So you're never thinking, I definitely have the next go. You know that there's a risk that you won't. Yeah. This similarly in the, you know, and given it's only been a handful of games that I played, I have yet to see a series of activations such that it's completely destroyed the balance of the game. There have been swings one way or the other. Yeah. As we saw. And you had a real bad run there for a while.
Yeah, where my senior judge failed. Over
and over and over.
So every time I tried to pull his shit out, he would fail every single time. And then for quite a few of the activations, because he was pinned the next turn, I would fail the pin roll as well. So my senior judge only got 1 out of his 2 actions again and again, and it was super frustrating. But then later on, he was it all came out in the wash. Exactly.
He won the game. Yeah.
And he won the game because I was able to pop his chit out a second time, and it got pulled a second time when there were 2 chits in the bag, and his was one of them, and Max Bubba was the other. And I needed Max Bubba to not go, and I needed to go. So I was able to do that. And that worked. I feel like, so if you're looking for a hard-nosed competitive game that you can play in a tournament and you're going to get fair, even consistency in every game that you play, this is not the game for you. However, if you're looking for fun, I mean, it is. And when I say that, I'm not just saying it's got problems that you need to overcome. I actually don't think that at all. I think it really does come out in the wash. The averages work out that like bolt action, if you don't like the order dice system, you probably won't like the chit system. And this almost leans into that a little bit more because of the star chits. That said, it feels good. I mean, yes, there are some moments where you're like, that's bad. But that happens in bolt action. What's the old expression? Bolt action happens? Well, Judge Dredd happens. It's the same thing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Like, I think this is a good, what's described as a beer and pretzels game. You
Yeah.
know? It's a good game to play with. Well, first of all, it's a good game to play with people who are fans of 2000 AD stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
Fans of Judge Dredd, because it's, as you've said, it's got a lot of flavor. It does allow you to run around as a very small forces of judges, taking on much greater odds and feeling ultra powerful in doing it. But it is not. It's clear that they haven't gone into this going, we need to really make sure that everything is as balanced as it possibly could be, and that there's, like, you need to have. There needs to be some degree of gentleman's agreement is probably an archaic term at this point, but a gentleman's agreement around how. Around playing the game and playing fair and making sure that everyone's having a good time.
Yeah.
Not just, I'm going to exploit cost values and try and wring the best force I can out of the rule set and abuse it as much as possible, because I don't think it will hold up to that. I don't think it'll be a fun game playing it that way. It's just... I don't think that's within the design philosophy.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, and I could not agree more. As you say, though, I mean, just it's so full of flavor. And, I mean, again, coming back to, you get an option of what gear cards your crew gets and what Meg 1 cards you get. And you do get dealt extra gear cards, and then you discard some of them. So you can really flavor the stuff you get to the Force. And, again, between the special rules of the models themselves, between those gear cards, between the Meg cards, you really do get a 2000 AD experience, unlike, and I don't get me wrong, I love games like 7TV, and they are also very fun and fluffy, and they have some of the similar cards. But I have rules to play Dredd using 7TV. I think that the Dredd game, and I love 7TV, does a much better job of representing that universe than 7TV does, if that makes sense. Another thing that I think leans into that and really gets into that narrative play is, and we're going to talk about both of these things, so I'll start with the lesser point and get to the bigger one, is one, characters, when they get wounded, their stats get worse. I guess when I was a little kid playing Warhammer 40,000 and other games, as my characters were getting wounded, I always sort of wondered, oh, they're just as tough now as when they started. In this game, you deteriorate, and you deteriorate something shocking. And so, even the ability for you to, like, your cool stat drops for every wound you take. So you actually start, like, your ability to put your star chip back in the bag suffers badly if you are wounded. And I think that really also gives you the feel of the comic, and you can heal yourself. There are ways of like getting behind cover and, trying to patch yourself up. And there's, of course, med packs and things like that straight out of the comic book. But then not only does that make it feel narrative, but then you pair that with the missions that are in the book. They feel very Judge Dreddy as well, where, the judges are coming on the board and there are people seeing them and running the other direction, trying to get off the board away from them. That feels very Judge Dredd too, literally like the comic you just described. And that's in there. So I think that those two elements, combined with everything else we talked about, really does make this game feel super cinematic and narrative. So let's go back to the diminishing attributes. Did you want to touch on that, or?
Yeah. So look, this is actually one of my favorite aspects of the game. I really like the way the wounds system is handled, because so every time you take an injury, or which might be a permanent injury or a stun, which is equivalent to an injury, every stat you have is dropped by 1. Every stat. It includes your movement. So your movement drops an inch. Your cool drops a stat. Your shooting stat drops. Your fighting stat drops. And you'll often get into the situation where say you've got a cool of 4 and a shoot of 3. If you take 3 wounds, you're still alive, but your shoot stat is now 0, which means that without any other modifiers on it, you can no longer shoot. And you really need to address that. You need to do something about it. So characters that start super tough can be whittled down, through the course of the game. And again, we saw this with Judge Giant, where I was able to get him down to a cool of 1 from 5, I think he starts at.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Senior Street Judge, I think, is the actual card we're using. But yeah, so he no, sorry, we could only drop him to 2 because he had a special rule.
I was about to say
he's
got a special rule.
Fortitude, yeah. So he ignores the first injury. But but his stats were so reduced that he went from being this super soldier to just limping around and failing at everything he tried to do until you were able to actually hide him behind something and heal him. And it was your street judge, your
quote unquote rookie,
who came in and managed to clear the field a little bit for him to give him that opportunity to heal up that let him then win the game. Look, it's a really exciting thing where as the underdog or as the player who's got less capable characters, you can whittle down those big tough opponents. Having said all of that, of course, Judge Dredd never suffers from stat loss. Judge Dredd is always Judge Dredd,
which is why he's 35 points.
Yes.
Whereas even the super street judge that I was playing the other day was nowhere near that.
It's 23, I think.
Yeah, 23. Yeah. And so, I mean, sure, Judge Dredd's only 12 more, but for 12 more, you can get a whole other judge. Literally, a street judge, regular street judge is 13. And if you wanted to get a white helmet rookie, it's 11. So,
also there's, if we're going outside the judges, there are, you can pick up characters for 2, 3, notoriety. Like there's some low cost.
Gang juves are literally 2. Gang punks are 3. The gang heavy, and when I say heavy, it isn't like Necromunda where they're carrying a heavy weapon, which I found confusing at first. That just means that they're like the big dog. They're 5, and then if you really want to get into like a big named character, you can have a block gang lieutenant for 13. Now, what's cool about, and I'm going to sideline here for a little bit. The judges get fairly standard equipment, and then you can upgrade them through the equipment cards and or by the rules that are in the book. The block gang, though, there's a slew of options that you can upgrade each and every model one way or another to really give them A, the flavor, but also B, to match your models. Like, you can really give your crew character and feel like you're invested in them. And I think it's great.
So this actually speaks to something. So for anyone who's actually read through or played Strontium Dog and is looking at Dredd, this actually speaks to one of the differences in the two games that I found quite interesting. So Strontium Dog was almost exclusively named characters. So it did have rules for building your own characters, but all the costed characters listed were named characters. Dredd has got a list of just ganger, gang punk, gang juve, this is how much it costs to buy something like that. Strontium Dog had a collateral system that I'm not going to get into. This is more just for those people who have seen that. That's gone in Judge Dredd. So instead of having a random collection of extras that you might add onto your force as you had in Strontium Dog, Judge Dredd, you just pay for what you're going to get. So you say, I want, 4 juves and they're going to cost me 8 notoriety all up. I want, two gang heavies and they're going to cost me 10 notoriety all up. So you're calculating exactly, and there's points values specifically for those unnamed grunt characters. That Strontium Dog didn't really... there were rules for it, but it didn't appear to be encouraged in the way that the game was set up.
And I like that. That feels better to me because you're paying for what you get.
Yeah.
Which, I think really does make sense.
Yeah, and look, it also allows you to, I mean, a lot of the comic strips are Dredd facing off against a number of either unnamed or virtually unnamed characters. You know, there's a lot of expendable characters in there, and it's good to be able to sort of set that up so you have your named judge and then a whole bunch of mooks that you that they're taking down, rather than it's always got to be this collection of specific named characters.
Yes,
you know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think one of the things, I mean, we talked about a few minutes ago was the feel of Mega City 1. And Mega City 1 should feel crowded. And the Stallone Dredd movie, you saw people everywhere. And in the comic book, you see people everywhere. And one of the things that I really like about this game is there are rules for the average citizen. You can have crowds in this game. And there are rules for what they do. And it's random. You don't control them. And, you know, whether you want to put them in your table, on the table or not, that's up to you and the mission. But they're there, and I just think it's cool that, again, you're acknowledging, again, it's a narrative feel. It spreads the universe. It stretches it out. So it feels like you're in the middle of an actual city with citizens. Now, I did notice that, you know, not everyone likes to paint, you know, NPC citizens when you're spending all your time painting judges and painting gangers / miniatures for other game systems. I get that. If this is a side fun game you want to play with your friends, you may have a project for a tournament or, you know, an event that you also have to paint. So I understand that. But I did pick up a pack of the silhouettes from Knights of Dice. Yeah. And, man, they look good. And it's just laser cut acrylic in sort of a gray color of the outline. So it looks kind of like a shadow of a person. And there's 10 of them in a pack. And I got it for $20 from a shop. I think it's even cheaper from their website. And it's cool. You can put it on the tabletop. And it's almost like they don't matter because they're just shadowy outlines. But they're still on the table. And I think, again, to have that on the tabletop, I mean, if you have the time and the inkling to go out and, especially with contrast paints and everything else that's happening these days, you could easily paint up some citizens and throw them down. Maybe not put the same detail in there. Maybe you do if you really want to do that. Painting the citizens of Mega City 1 would be fun. I mean, there's some pretty wacky outfits out there. But does that make sense? Like, I really like that that's there. I think it's fun, and I think, again, it adds a lot to the universe and the game itself.
Yeah, and look, I think the citizens rule set, it certainly isn't something I would use in every game, because, you know, they do have an activation system, and you're going to be rolling for them and moving them around and so forth, which, you know, in some games you might not want to bog it down by doing that, but the rules being in there and you being able to play that thematic game of, all right, we're actually going through a crowd here, and, you know, whereas your bad guys, quote unquote, you know, may not be all that fussed about accidentally shooting a civilian. Yeah. Your judges, you know, are heavily penalized for doing so in the fluff. And you know what? This brings me to something really interesting about this game that I really like, but I think it also really speaks to the nature of the game. And that is, and I can't remember the word for it, it is the... what's the conviction thing called?
I'm looking for it. So yeah, there's an entire section on of course now I can't think of it, but the sentences. If a
sentencing,
judge,
yes, of course. Yeah, there's a whole section on sentencing, and unless you're playing a campaign, this has literally no effect on your game. Like it does not. It happens post game, and it's completely irrelevant to whether you're going to win or lose the thing. But the rule set contains within it a way to calculate or to identify the sentences of everyone you take down, to sentence them. There's mechanics for duration of sentence and all that stuff. And that really speaks to, again, like, this is a Dredd game, and it's designed with that in mind, and it is everything about it has that flavor inherent to it. I love that they included those rules. It absolutely was not necessary. And it's great that they're in there.
Yeah, especially given that some of those sentences, I mean, literally, if you're playing fun one-off games like we were, as you say, they're completely useless.
Yeah.
But the fact that you can still roll, that's 15 years in the ISO cubes, punk. Yeah, cool, fun.
What other rule set can tell you how many years in an ISO cube you get for public boinging?
Exactly, right?
It's fantastic.
Yeah, clearly, I mean, obviously, talking to Andy, massive 2000 AD fan. I mean, all Roger and Gav, we're all massive 2000 AD fans. And the guys from Warlord, Paul Sawyer's a massive Judge Dredd fan as well. I know a lot of the Warlord guys are. So it makes perfect sense that all of the universe got crammed into this game. And unlike the Stallone movie, it fits. Like, it doesn't feel longer than it does. The games are short, sharp, punchy, and fun. And man, it feels good.
I would absolutely agree with that. I have really enjoyed the games I've played so far. I think, there's things that you're going to have to work with your opponent to, we had a foot race game where we discovered that the distance to the board edge was more or less a single move. So in doing that again, we'd have to sit down and go, okay, how big does the board need to be? How are we going to bog it down?
Larger.
Like, how are we going to make this work so it's fun? And again, that's the sort of game it is. It's where you sit down and go, how are we going to make this? How are we going to have a fun game? What situation are we going to set up? What is this going to represent? And how are we going to make this as fun as possible for everyone that's playing? And just go with it.
And again, I think going back to something I said before, I mean, looking at your beautifully painted models on an actual city board, but we also talked about how you could put desert terrain down and play Cursed Earth. Just having those models for a license that we both love, having or IP, whatever you want to say, characters from that universe on the tabletop, and then being able to push them around and having them do what they're quote unquote supposed to do. They feel like those characters. And the fact that you're able to play out those games in a narrative and beautiful fashion, man, it feels good. Like it I expected to like this game. I'm pleasantly surprised that I like it more than I probably thought I would. I'll be honest there. I wasn't expecting, to really love this game. And then sitting down and playing it, damn, it felt good. To the point where now I'm like, how do I slide some gangers and a couple of judges into my painting queue just so we can play? And we have a 2000 AD day coming up. Was it the 1st of February? Are we still figuring
March,
out?
I think.
1st of March, yeah. So I got a little bit of time. And if you're in Melbourne listening to this and you want to play 2000 AD, please contact the podcast because we are going to have a day. And, it's not going to be a tournament. It'll just be going to probably good games in the city with some friends, setting up some tables, and just mates playing games. So hell yeah. I think that'll be excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, probably one final thing I'd say about this game is I think it's a great gateway game.
Yeah.
I have played it now with
That's a good point.
a couple of people who are not tabletop wargamers, who have never played tabletop wargames before, and they got the rules very quickly.
Yeah.
It's a simple system. This is maybe a little bit exceptional, but I did strip down the rules a little, and my 5-year-old daughter was able to play this with Lego. So
nice.
Again, I'm not saying that's the game is by standard that simple, but it is very approachable. It's very simple. The core box, even without painting, there'd be very little work you'd need to do to actually, have a crack at it.
Absolutely.
I'm a fan, and I encourage people to try it out.
Absolutely. And again, I mean, in the core box, as you say, the Strontium Dog box, you get, the 3 heroic models, and then you get the 5 villain models, and it balances to be the same points. Dredd, you could definitely do that with the 2 judges, depending on how you kit them out and what experience level you give them, and the same with the gangers. But you have the 2 judges and the 6 gangers.
8
gangers?
Yeah, I think so.
So you get a pile of models in this box set. And it just, I get the feeling just opening the box and putting it down on the table, you can really just get some good games in. And the replayability, I mean, we played 2 games where I ran the same 2 judges and you ran the same 5 gang guys. And, didn't feel old. No, I wasn't tired of playing it. I was happy to, and I have a very short attention span with these things. And so for me to be like, cool, let's play some more games. Cool. And I only had 2 models. And for me, to hold my attention span with 2 models in a game is saying something. So, I think that should be mentioned as well. Now, I think I've run out of all of my talking points for today. But, John, I think that was a very good way of summing it up. I think it has the hallmarks of a Warlord game in that it's easy to pick up, but it's got tactical depth.
Yeah.
And it's all about how it feels, and I think it definitely feels the right way for what you'd expect of wanting to put 2000 AD scenarios, situations on the tabletop.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that.
Right on. Well, guys, I think that is an hour and 40 minutes in. I think we may call it a day. Now, that is a little long for Cast Ice, but we did want to sort of combine a movie watching / character discussion with a gaming discussion, which is a little different from the cast as you normally hear it. If you liked this, if you like the idea of having a lengthy discussion of maybe a book or a movie at the beginning and then the gaming aspects at the end, let us know. Go to the Cast Ice Podcast Facebook page. You can find it by going to Facebook and typing CASTDICE and message the page. You'll get one guy. That's me. My name's Brad, and I will respond as soon as I get your messages. I have had a few people say, I'm surprised how long it took you to get back to me. That was because when they messaged, it was the middle of the night in Australia, and I'm sorry, guys, I turn my ringer off at night. Anyway, guys, please message. And again, for all the people who have been sending lovely messages in the new year about, wishing me well for 2020 and, Happy New Year. Thank you very much. As always, it is very appreciated. And outside of today, where I actually am looking at a human being, it is a little, which is a little strange because I'm finding myself staring at the same spot that I always stare at when I'm podcasting. And poor John's like, I'm not sitting over there. I'm over here. And, it's where my eyes go when I think. It is a very, I think today's podcast has proven that I do tend to do this in isolation. And so having that contact with the outside world by having y'all message in is great. Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I think it is about that time. I think that means that we have to quote our good friend Casey. As always, when you are playing the games that we know and love, I hope your dice roll hot. I hope your beverages are cold. But more than anything else, we at Cast Dice hope that you are having fun. Good night.
Another day rising, Paraguayan sun. The fuel cracks open, another Heineken. He's all alone, he's in his little room. He's all alone, bend out.